In this video, I'll be providing you with a sample explication of a poem by William Shakespeare. Essentially, an explication of a poem is just a close reading of that poem. This is a skill we'll be practicing throughout this poetry unit, which you'll be applying in Essay 2. When you're assigned an explication of a poem, a good initial step is to begin by going over each line individually and making sure you understand exactly what's being said. A good way to do this is to try to paraphrase the poem line by line, putting it into your own words. That's where we'll begin with Shakespeare's poem, Sonnet 29. If you have not yet read Shakespeare's Sonnet 29, please pause the video and do so. The poem can be downloaded from the Course Information and Assignment Sheets page. You will probably want to have a printed hard copy in front of you when watching this video so that you can take some notes as we go along. Okay, now that you've read the poem at least once to yourselves, we can start looking at it together. First, I'll read the poem aloud once. Then, we'll break it down line by line. When, in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented least. Yet, in these thoughts myself almost despising, haply I think on thee. And then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. Now that we've heard the poem aloud, let's go line by line and break down the poem, putting it into our own words as much as we can. Line 1. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. Okay, so what do we think that it might mean to be in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes? If we look it up, we'll see that to be in disgrace means to have lost your reputation or the respect of others, the good position you had, in other words. So, when the speaker says that he is in disgrace with men's eyes, it sounds like he's saying that when other men look at him, all the speaker sees is how he's lost their respect or the reputation he once had. To be in disgrace with fortune is a little trickier, but again, let's think about what fortune can mean. A fortune can mean a large sum of money, but the word fortune by itself usually means your luck, like good or bad fortune. So it's sounding like this person is talking about a time when he feels like he's lost his luck and the respect he used to see in others' eyes. Now let's move to line 2. He says, when I've lost my reputation and am feeling most unlucky, I all alone beweep my outcast state. This line is a little more straightforward than the first one. It confirms some of what we thought about the speaker being down and out, since he tells us that he's all by himself, and he explains that when he's all by himself like this, what he does is cries about, beweeps, the rejected position he finds himself in, his outcast state. So far, this is a pretty depressing start. Let's see what happens next. After telling us about how he cries about his rejection and unluckiness, he says, and I trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries. Bootless is a really strange word, so we should probably look it up. It turns out that bootless means useless, so his cries are useless. And how useless are they? Well, apparently even heaven is deaf to these cries. So even heaven, the place many people believe that they can always turn to when no one else cares, isn't listening. And what does he do when he's in this position? Well, in line 4 he says, and I look upon myself and curse my fate. It sounds like when he's in this position, he takes a good look at himself, and even he doesn't like what he sees, since he curses, meaning to invoke a curse on something, which is right along the lines of saying, damn you, so-and-so, but the so-and-so here is his fate, meaning probably where fate has taken him or the course of his life so far. So apparently things are so bad that when he takes a good look at himself, all he can do is say, damn you, about where he finds himself in life. Right after he curses his current position, he says in lines 5 and 6, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed. So he starts wishing for or wanting something, specifically to be like something else. And what does he wish to be more like? Someone who's more rich in hope. Rich in hope is kind of a weird phrase, so let's break it down. If you're rich in something, it means you have a lot of that thing. So someone who's rich in hope would be someone who has a lot of hope. And a kind of person who has lots of hope is probably more of an optimist than our speaker sounds like, someone who's looking toward a brighter future. So he wishes that he had more hope, like some other people do, and he wishes that he was featured like him with friends possessed. Since he uses the pronoun him here, it sounds like he's looking at other guys that he can see or think of and wishing how he was more like them. So what kinds of things about those people does he wish he had? Well, your features usually refers to your physical features or how you look. So it sounds like he wishes that he looked more like this other guy or that he had more friends like yet another guy. While he's in this state of mind, he also tells us in the next line that he starts desiring this man's art or that man's scope. Desire is pretty easy to paraphrase. He obviously wants something that yet another guy has, but what do we think it is? Well, art can mean a work of art, but it can also mean skills. So whether it's artistic skills or not, it seems like he wants to have the skills that another man has. He also wants some guy's scope. Scope is tricky, but it can be the extent or range of something, so perhaps he wants this other guy's range of abilities or power or knowledge. Whatever it is, we can tell at this point that the speaker does not seem to be very content with what he has and what he's like, because he wishes and desires to be like so many other men, or to have what they have. This self-loathing seems to be confirmed when we get to the next line, in which the speaker says that he's reached the point where I am, with what I most enjoy, contented least. If you're contented, you're happy or satisfied. But we know that he is not very happy or satisfied with something since he adds least after contented. And if you go back to the beginning of the line, you see that what brings him the least happiness or satisfaction at this point is stuff that he usually enjoys the most. So he's so down in the dumps that he can't even enjoy the stuff that he usually likes. Next, he says in line 9, yet in these thoughts myself almost despising. To despise something is to hate it. So this line confirms the idea that we've been building up, that he's starting to hate himself. Significantly though, he says almost despising here. So while he might be moving towards self-hate, he's not quite there at this point. In addition, the first word in the line is yet. Yet as a transitional word means something like nevertheless or in spite of. So maybe this is suggesting a turn of some sort. And what could be happening that would lead to a turn? Well, he tells us in the next lines that at this point, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. If you look it up, you'll see that thee just means you. So now he seems to be talking to someone who he's thinking of. And when he thinks of this person now, his state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. We can tell that he's comparing his state to something since he says it's like that thing, But what does he compare his state to? A lark at break of day arising from sullen earth. Since a lark seems to be the basis of the speaker's comparison, we should probably look this up too. It turns out that a lark is a small songbird. So he's comparing his state, maybe meaning his state of mind, to a songbird that rises from the gloomy ground, the sullen earth in other words, at dawn or break of day, and sing songs of praise, hymns, high up in the sky. We'll spend more time on this image later, but this seems like a much more positive picture than what we've been hearing so far, which confirms the turn in his feelings that words like yet in line 8 suggested. At this point, we might be wondering why thinking of this person would cause such a change, so let's keep reading to see if we can figure it out. In the last 2 lines, the speaker says, "For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings." For usually means because, so it looks like he will be telling us what's brought about this change. And what is it? Well, thy means your, so it sounds like remembering the love of this person who he's speaking to brings him wealth, so an abundance of something good. This wealth makes him scorn something. That seems important, so we should probably look up scorn, just as we've been doing with other challenging words. To scorn something means to show it disdain, to reject it. And what does he reject now in light of the wealth brought by remembering this person's sweet love? He rejects the idea of changing his state, his position in life probably, with kings. So now that he's remembered this person's love, he wouldn't even change places with a king, even though earlier it sounded like he'd be willing to change places with almost anyone. Okay. Now that we've carefully paraphrased the poem and we understand the basics of what's happening in the poem and what it's about, we want to look back at it again and think about other details we notice. The sorts of things mentioned in the reading elements of poetry in Reading and Writing About Literature, and in the video you've already watched on sound and rhythm in poetry. First of all, if we look back, we might notice that parts of the poem rhyme. A common way to trace the rhyme scheme in a poem is to use letters of the alphabet to mark the rhymes. It would look like this. Eyes and cries are A because eyes rhymes with cries, and state and fate are B because state rhymes with fate. The rhymes continue with hope and scope, possessed and least. This one might be more of a slant rhyme, a kind of rhyme where the sound at the end matches but the rhyme isn't perfect. But at the same time, if you were pronouncing it with a British Renaissance era accent, it would probably be a closer rhyme than it sounds like to us. Then we have despising, arising, fate, state, and finally, the last 2 lines with brings and kings. Now that we've marked the rhyme scheme, we can think about whether the rhyme scheme helps to reinforce or relate to the meaning of the poem. For instance, notice how it breaks the poem up into chunks. We have one 4-line chunk, then another, and finally a 4th chunk. The first 2 chunks are all about how alone the speaker feels. Devoting 2 whole chunks of the poem to this topic really emphasizes the speaker's dejection and depression. But a change occurs right at that 3rd chunk there, that's in purple. And the change in the rhyming helps to emphasize this. And the answer to the paradox of this quick change is also emphasized by a change in structure, since the final 2 lines form their own little set. And this set explains why the change occurred. So, the rhyme scheme seems to help mark the changes in the poet's mental state and why this mental state changes. Incidentally, 4-line groupings like this are called quatrains, think quattro, and 2-line groupings are called couplets. They're composed of a couple of lines. But notice how you didn't need to know this in order to think about the poem's structure and its meaning, to read it carefully. Another use of sound that comes up in elements of poetry in the video you just watched on poetic rhythm is consonance and assonance. Consonance, if you recall, is the repetition of consonant sounds, like the repetition of S in Sally sells soup. And assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds, like the ah sound in Molly dropped the olives. This comes up in Sonnet 29 in line 2, which starts all alone. It's a perfect example of both consonance and assonance, since we get the repetition of the consonant L sound and the vowel ah sound. If we read over this line a few times, we might notice that this instance of consonance and assonance slows down the phrase, which adds extra weight to the idea of the aloneness. Since it's hard to say this fast, it makes you feel the time spent alone more and emphasizes how alone the speaker feels. While repetition of sound is worth paying attention to in a poem, it's also good to be on the lookout for other kinds of repetition, such as repetition of words. So what words repeat in this poem? It looks like state and heaven both come up more than once. When words repeat, some things you might think about are how the meanings might be different in the different contexts, or how their repeated use might serve to emphasize something in the poem. Let's look at each of these instances of repetition individually. First, let's look at heaven. In the first use in line 3, heaven is referred to as deaf, not hearing at all the speaker's cries. When we look at the second use of heaven in line 12, we can notice that sound is again associated with heaven. But instead of bootless cries, there's joyful singing. So this repetition really helps to emphasize the change that we've already started tracking. Now let's look at state. The first time state comes up in line 2, it's explicitly tied to the feelings of dejection and being alone that come up again and again in the initial lines, since it's described here as the speaker's outcast state. With a word like state, we should keep in mind that it can have multiple meanings or connotations. Your state can refer to the position you're in, like your state of being, your location, or your location mentally, like your state of mind. The speaker seems to be referring on the surface here to the earlier line where he talks about being in disgrace with men's eyes. That is, nobody likes him. So on the surface, outcast state seems to be referring to his feeling of not being part of the society to which he belongs. Of course, the next 7 lines after this also highlight that this feeling of being outcast has affected his state of mind as well. Now let's look at the next time the word state comes up. This line reads, "And now my state, like to the lark at break of day arising." Since it would be difficult for his physical position to arise, he's probably referring to his state of mind here. Again, just like the use of heaven, this repeated use of state, when tracked, helps to emphasize the drastic change that occurs in the speaker's mood, and that his place in relation to others seems to affect his emotional state. State comes up a third time in the final line, where the speaker says that he would scorn to change his state with kings. Since he's talking about a kind of job in a way, he's probably referring to his position in society here. So now we get another full circle. Not only does he feel better and no longer outcast, in fact, this guy, who would have previously changed places with almost anyone, someone more optimistic, someone better looking, someone with a different art or skill, now wouldn't even change places with a king. While we got this message through our paraphrase initially, we can see that Shakespeare's use of repetition and the multiple meanings of the word state serves to further emphasize the 180 in the speaker's perspective that occurs during the course of the poem. In addition to a poem's sounds, rhythms, word choices, and uses of repetition, imagery and figurative uses of language are 2 more things it's helpful to pay attention to within a poem when you're reading it closely or explicating it. Some examples of figurative language are metaphors and similes. And a metaphor, 2 things are usually thought to be dissimilar are treated as if they were alike. For instance, if I have a student in a class named Richard and another student says about Richard, "Richard is a pig," that second student is employing a metaphor to voice her opinion about Richard, provided, of course, that Richard is a human in my class and not actually a pig. When someone uses a metaphor like this, they usually do so in order to connect some of the associations we have with one thing to something else that we would normally think of as different. So by saying that Richard is a pig, this student is probably implying that Richard has pig-like characteristics, like maybe he's really dirty, or smells bad, or he'll eat anything, or he acts like an animal in another way. A simile is just like a metaphor, except that it's a more explicit comparison where we use words such as like or as to directly compare two things that, at least on the surface, seem to be pretty dissimilar. For instance, if I said, "My love is like a rose," that would be a simile. So does Shakespeare employ any similes or metaphors in his poem? The answer is yes. If we think back to our paraphrase, we'll remember that near the end of the poem, he compares his state, and we thought state of mind at this point, to a lark. The exact lines are, "And then my state, like to the lark, at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate." So the simile here is, "My state is like a lark." If we recall from our paraphrase, a lark is a small songbird. When thinking about a simile or a metaphor and what effect its use has, it's a good idea to brainstorm all of the associations we have with the thing that the author is comparing something to. Since Shakespeare is comparing his state of mind or emotional state to a lark, let's brainstorm the associations we have with birds more generally, or larks more specifically. So let's see. When we think of birds, we often think of flying, maybe the freedom associated with flying. And if a bird is a songbird, we probably think of chirping and trilling bird sounds, which usually sound pretty cheerful. In the earlier lines of the poem, the speaker seemed almost trapped in a self-doubt downward spiral that he couldn't break out of. Now, though, by using this simile of the lark to describe his mental state and emotional state, the speaker is mapping the associations we have with birds onto his mental or emotional state, which really vividly gives us the sense of how much freer and more cheerful he is when he thinks of this person he loves. Of course, Shakespeare packs in more imagery in these lines than just the simple simile, "My state is like a lark." Imagery is any sort of sensory picture that the poet builds up with his or her word choices. So in these lines, there's not just a lark, but a lark that, at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. This imagery adds even more to the initial simile, since sullen earth, remember gloomy ground, becomes almost a metaphor for how he was feeling before, gloomy and grounded, and break of day suggests a new day, which introduces the idea that thinking of this person almost gives the speaker a new start, about which he seems pretty joyful and thankful, since this bird doesn't just lift off from the sullen earth, it then sings out songs of praise to heaven. So if the speaker was spiraling downwards deeper and deeper into dissatisfaction in the poem's earlier lines, the lark that rises from the sullen earth and sings hymns is a particularly effective image for getting us to think about how his spirits are now uplifted. We've already noticed a lot in this fairly short 14-line poem, but I don't want to let you go without mentioning one more thing that we can pay attention to when explicating a poem. If you recall, when you created your poems at the end of the last module from diction that I provided for you, I suggested that you could do whatever you wanted when it came to the syntax, the sentence construction, and punctuation, in other words. So let's see what we notice about Shakespeare's syntax in this poem and what might be significant about it. If we look back, we'll notice that at the end of each line until we get to line 8, there's a comma and no periods. All of these commas create the effect of an unending list, in this case, of ways in which the speaker feels dissatisfied with himself and his Latin life. The use of commas really drives home how incessant these worries and anxieties are. Since there are no periods here, it suggests that the worries and dissatisfactions never stop. They just come one right after the other in a downward spiral of depression with hardly even any time to take a breath. At the end of line 8, though, there's a semicolon, which is a form of punctuation that separates complete thoughts, much as a period does. And the next line, as we've seen, marks the beginning of a change in the speaker's thoughts and feelings with the word yet. So we can see that in addition to the rhyme scheme and the use of repetition, the punctuation even reinforces and emphasizes the change in the speaker's state of mind. I know I've gone into a lot of details in talking about this poem with you today. And you may not find significance in all of these kinds of details in every poem at which you look closely. Or other kinds of details may seem more important in other poems. What I'm hoping, though, is that this has given you a sense of how closely you can read or explicate something as short as a poem, and the added meaning that doing so can provide.